Hi.
I suppose every story about betrayal begins the same way, with trust. Mine was no different. I trusted my wife, Sophie, implicitly. For the past 15 years, she had been my rock, my partner, and my confidant. We built a life together, shared secrets, and created routines that felt unbreakable. At least that's what I thought. Life in our small town was predictable, almost idyllic. We had 2 children, a dog that chewed through everything in sight, and a modest house with a yard big enough for summer barbecues. I worked as a contractor, often taking on projects that kept me out late, while Sophie managed a small art gallery downtown. Her work was her passion, and I admired the way she threw herself into it. When I saw her glowing at an opening or speaking animatedly to a customer, I felt proud to call her my wife. The first cracks appeared so subtly that I almost missed them. Sophie had always been busy with gallery events, but over the past few months, her absences began to feel different. She claimed to be attending more networking events, traveling to nearby cities to meet potential clients or scout artists. It seemed reasonable enough. The art world was competitive, and she had always been ambitious. But there was something in the way she avoided eye contact when she told me about these trips, the way she'd quickly change the subject if I pressed for details. I didn't want to doubt her. I had no reason to, or at least that's what I told myself. The tipping point came on an otherwise ordinary Wednesday. I had come home early from a job site, hoping to surprise Sophie with lunch. The house was quiet when I walked in, save for the soft hum of the washing machine in the laundry room. Her phone was on the kitchen counter, buzzing with notifications. Sophie rarely left her phone unattended, and for some reason that tiny detail struck me as unusual. I tried to ignore it, focusing instead on the takeout containers I had brought home. But when another notification popped up on the screen, my curiosity got the better of me. I glanced at the phone, expecting to see messages about the gallery or from one of her friends. Instead, there was a name I didn't recognize. A man's name. The message preview was innocuous enough, but it still sent a chill down my spine. "Can't wait to see you again." My stomach dropped. I told myself it could be innocent, that it was probably a misunderstanding. But as I stood there staring at the phone, a sickening sense of dread settled over me. I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, staring into an abyss I wasn't ready to face. I didn't confront Sophie that day. Instead, I began paying closer attention to her behavior. Over the next few weeks, I noticed the little things that had once escaped me. The way she'd step outside to take certain calls, the quick glances at her phone followed by a faint smile, the way she seemed distracted even during family dinners. I hated the growing suspicion in my chest, hated how it made me feel like an intruder in my own life. My breaking point came on a Saturday morning. Sophie had left early, claiming she needed to meet a potential artist in the neighboring city. The kids were at a friend's house, and I found myself alone with nothing but my thoughts. That's when I decided to take a closer look at her phone. I hated myself for the invasion of privacy, but the doubt had become unbearable. What I found confirmed my worst fears. There were messages between Sophie and a man named Greg, messages that left no room for interpretation. They spoke of secret rendezvous, of moments stolen between gallery events, of plans for weekends that didn't involve me or the kids. Each word felt like a knife to the chest, cutting deeper than I thought possible. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the screen as the reality of Sophie's betrayal sank in. The woman I had trusted with my heart and my life had been leading a double life, building something with another man while I remained oblivious. The anger came first, hot and consuming, followed by a wave of sadness so profound it left me gasping for air. I wanted to confront her immediately, to demand answers, but a part of me held back. I needed time to process, to figure out what this meant for our marriage, for our family. More than that, I needed to understand why. Why had she done this? What had driven her to seek comfort in someone else? The days that followed were some of the hardest of my life. I couldn't look at Sophie without seeing the messages, without wondering if she was thinking about Greg even as she smiled at me. I went through the motions of our daily routine, pretending everything was fine for the kids' sake. But inside, I was unraveling. I started keeping a journal, writing down my thoughts and observations in an attempt to make sense of everything. The act of putting pen to paper was strangely therapeutic, a way to channel my pain and confusion. I wrote about the messages, about the way Sophie's eyes lit up when she spoke about the gallery, about the small moments of tenderness that still lingered between us despite the growing distance. One night, as I was writing, a thought occurred to me. What if there was more to this than met the eye? The messages were damning, yes, but they didn't tell the whole story. I needed to know the truth, not just the pieces Sophie had chosen to share with Greg. I needed to see the full picture before I could decide what to do. That's when I decided to follow her. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. Sophie mentioned another networking event in the city, a gallery opening that she claimed was critical for her career. She left the house dressed impeccably, her smile warm but slightly strained. As soon as she drove off, I grabbed my keys and followed at a safe distance, my heart pounding with a mix of fear and determination. She drove to a hotel downtown, parking in the far corner of the lot. I watched from a distance as she entered the lobby, her phone in hand. Moments later, Greg appeared, his demeanor casual but unmistakably familiar. They greeted each other with an ease that spoke of countless meetings like this, their body language intimate in a way that made my stomach churn. I stayed in the car, watching as they disappeared into the hotel. I felt a strange mix of validation and devastation, the confirmation of my suspicions bringing no comfort. The woman I loved, the mother of my children, was having an affair. And now I had to decide what to do about it. When Sophie returned home later that night, she was all smiles, chatting about the event as though nothing had happened. I played along, my own smile forced, my responses clipped. Inside I was seething, but I knew I needed to bide my time. Confronting her in the heat of the moment wouldn't solve anything. I needed to be smart, to think carefully about my next steps. As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I realized that this was only the beginning. Sophie's betrayal had cracked the foundation of our marriage, but the questions it raised were far from answered. Why had she done this? Was our marriage salvageable? And most importantly, how would I protect my children from the fallout? The path ahead was uncertain, filled with pain and difficult choices. But one thing was clear. I couldn't ignore the truth any longer. The time for pretending was over. The days after witnessing Sophie's betrayal were a haze of conflicting emotions. I went to work, played with the kids, and carried on with life as though nothing had changed. But inside, I was drowning. Every glance at her, every shared meal, felt like a performance. She was acting as if everything was normal, and perhaps in her mind, it was. The audacity of her deceit left me oscillating between rage and sorrow. I couldn't bear the idea of confrontation yet. Instead, I needed to understand more. Who was Greg? What had Sophie been seeking in him that she no longer found in me? And, most importantly, how far had this gone? I began searching for answers, though part of me dreaded what I might uncover. I started by diving into her digital life. Late at night, when Sophie was asleep, I accessed her emails and social media accounts. It felt wrong, invasive, but I convinced myself it was necessary. The messages between her and Greg painted a picture of their relationship, an affair that was calculated, passionate, and deeply emotional. They exchanged long emails about their hopes and dreams, about frustrations with their lives, and, most painfully, about me. Sophie described feeling neglected, unfulfilled, and disconnected. Reading her words was like reliving every argument we'd ever had, but amplified and twisted by her perspective. I saw myself through her eyes. A man who worked late, who brought his stress home, and who had stopped noticing the little things that made her feel special. There was truth in her complaints, but they were wrapped in betrayal, making them impossible to address with any clarity. The more I read, the clearer it became that Greg wasn't some fleeting fling. He was a colleague of hers, someone she'd met during an art convention a year ago. Their shared interest in the arts had quickly turned into mutual admiration, and then into something far deeper. They had built a fantasy together, one where responsibilities like kids, bills, and a husband didn't exist. One email, in particular, stood out. It was dated 2 weeks before I discovered their relationship. Sophie had written to Greg about feeling torn, about how much she cared for him, but also about how much she loved our children. She never mentioned me by name in that email, but it was clear she felt trapped between two lives. Reading her words didn't make her betrayal any easier to accept, but it added a layer of complexity that I hadn't anticipated. Sophie wasn't just running away from our marriage. She was running toward something she believed she had lost. With every new piece of evidence, I felt the walls of my life closing in. The anger that simmered beneath the surface threatened to boil over, but I forced myself to remain composed. I needed a plan, not an outburst. The children deserved stability, even if my world was falling apart. One evening, as Sophie sat across from me at the dinner table, chatting about her day, I couldn't help but study her. She was as radiant as ever, her laughter infectious as she engaged with the kids. To an outsider, she was the perfect wife and mother. But now, I saw the cracks in her performance. The fleeting moments when her gaze would drop, the slightly forced tone in her voice when she addressed me directly. She knew something was off, but I could tell she was hoping I hadn't noticed. The idea of following her again felt both repugnant and necessary. I needed confirmation of what I had read, proof that Greg was still in the picture. So, the next time she mentioned a gallery trip, I did exactly that. This time, I was more prepared. I took a different car, kept a greater distance, and brought a camera to document what I saw. She met Greg at a small cafe on the outskirts of town. From my vantage point across the street, I watched as they leaned in close, their hands brushing briefly over the table. They spoke animatedly, their faces lighting up in ways I hadn't seen from Sophie in years. It was heartbreaking, infuriating, and oddly mesmerizing all at once. I captured photos of their interaction, though I wasn't entirely sure what I'd do with them. After they left the cafe, I followed them to a park where they strolled hand in hand, pausing occasionally to admire the scenery. They looked like any ordinary couple, blissfully unaware of the chaos their actions were causing. It was in that moment that I realized just how far removed Sophie had become from the life we'd built together. This wasn't just a lapse in judgment. It was a choice. Returning home that night, I felt a strange sense of calm. The anger hadn't subsided, but it had been replaced by determination. Sophie's affair was no longer a vague suspicion or a series of cryptic messages. It was a reality, one that required action. But the question remained, what kind of action? I spent the next few days consulting a lawyer, trying to understand my options. Divorce seemed inevitable, but I wanted to ensure that whatever happened next would minimize the impact on the kids. The lawyer was sympathetic but blunt, laying out the challenges of custody battles and financial negotiations. It was a sobering conversation, but one that gave me a sense of control I hadn't felt in weeks. At the same time, I began preparing for the confrontation I knew was coming. I rehearsed what I would say, how I would present the evidence, and how I would respond to her excuses. Part of me wanted to yell, to demand answers, but I knew that approach wouldn't help. If I wanted the truth and a path forward, I needed to remain calm. When the day finally arrived, it felt almost anticlimactic. Sophie had just returned from another supposed gallery trip, her demeanor cheerful as she unpacked her bag in the kitchen. I waited until the kids were in bed before calling her into the living room. She looked at me with a mix of curiosity and apprehension, sensing the seriousness of my tone. I began by laying out everything I knew. The messages, the photos, the meetings. I spoke calmly but firmly, refusing to let my emotions get the better of me. As I presented each piece of evidence, Sophie's face fell, her initial attempts at denial crumbling under the weight of the truth. She sat in stunned silence as I finished, her hands trembling as she clutched the edge of the couch. What followed was a torrent of emotions. Tears, apologies, and attempts at explanations that only deepened my sense of betrayal. Sophie admitted to everything, though her reasons felt hollow. She spoke of feeling invisible, of longing for the excitement and passion that had once defined our relationship. She insisted that she never intended to hurt me or the kids, that she had been caught up in something she couldn't control. Her words might have softened me in another time, in another life. But now they felt like too little, too late. The damage was done, and no amount of regret could undo it. I told her as much, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. We agreed to take some time apart, for the sake of the kids and our own sanity. Sophie moved into a friend's apartment, leaving me to pick up the pieces of our fractured life. The house felt emptier without her, but it was a relief not to have her presence as a constant reminder of what had been lost. As I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, I realized that this was only the beginning. The road ahead would be long and difficult, filled with choices I never thought I'd have to make. But for the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope, a belief that, no matter how painful, I could find a way forward. The weeks following Sophie's departure were some of the most surreal of my life. The house felt emptier without her, though the kids and I did our best to fill the silence. They asked questions, of course. Why was Mommy staying somewhere else? Was she mad at me? I did my best to shield them from the truth, offering vague explanations about needing time to figure things out. Their innocence, their ability to adapt even as their world changed, gave me strength on the days I felt like I might crumble. But beneath the routines of school drop-offs, dinners, and bedtime stories, I was grappling with the enormity of what had happened. Sophie's betrayal was no longer just a personal wound. It had become a catalyst for self-reflection. How had we arrived here? What part had I played in the unraveling of our marriage? These questions haunted me, demanding answers I wasn't sure I had the capacity to find. I threw myself into my work, taking on extra projects to keep my mind occupied. The physical labor was a welcome distraction, each nail driven into wood or stroke of paint on a wall giving me a fleeting sense of accomplishment. But at night, when the kids were asleep and the house was quiet, the thoughts would return, swirling in my mind like a storm I couldn't escape. One evening, as I sat alone in the living room, I decided to revisit the journal I had started during the early days of my suspicions. Flipping through the pages, I was struck by how much had changed in such a short time. The uncertainty and doubt that had once consumed me had been replaced by a grim acceptance. But as I read my own words, I realized something else. There were still pieces of the puzzle missing. Sophie's affair, her choices, the pain she had caused, none of it made sense without understanding the deeper motivations behind it. It was then that I decided to speak with Sophie directly. We'd had only brief conversations since her departure, mostly about the kids or logistical matters. But if I was ever going to find closure, I needed to hear her side of the story, not through emails or texts, but face to face. I reached out to her, proposing a meeting at a neutral location. To my surprise, she agreed without hesitation. We met at a park near her friend's apartment. It was a warm afternoon, the kind of day that made it hard to believe life could hold such heaviness. Sophie arrived looking tired but composed, her eyes scanning the park before landing on me. She offered a tentative smile as she sat down across from me on a bench, her hands fidgeting nervously in her lap. I didn't waste time with small talk. I told her I needed to understand why she had done it, how it had started, what she had been thinking. She hesitated at first, her gaze fixed on the ground, but eventually, the words began to spill out. She spoke of feeling lost, of a sense of stagnation that had crept into her life without her even realizing it. The gallery, once her passion, had become a source of stress and frustration. Our marriage, she admitted, had felt distant for years, though she had never found the courage to tell me. When she met Greg at that art convention, she said, it was like a spark had been reignited. He made her feel seen, valued, in a way she hadn't felt in a long time. She knew it was wrong, knew it would hurt me if I found out, but she hadn't been able to stop herself. It was a selfish decision, she admitted, one driven by her own insecurities and need for validation. Listening to her, I felt a mix of emotions. Anger, sadness, and, surprisingly, a small measure of empathy. Sophie's words didn't excuse her actions, but they offered a glimpse into the pain and confusion she had been carrying. For the first time, I saw her not just as the woman who had betrayed me, but as someone who was struggling in her own way, who had made terrible choices out of a misguided attempt to find happiness. When she finished speaking, I asked her what she wanted now. Did she see a future for us? Could she imagine rebuilding what we had lost? Her response was hesitant but sincere. She said she wanted to try, but only if I was willing. She didn't expect forgiveness, didn't expect things to go back to the way they were, but she hoped we could find a way to move forward, for ourselves and for the kids. I told her I needed time to think, and she nodded, her expression a mixture of hope and resignation. As we parted ways, I couldn't help but feel the weight of the decision that lay ahead. Rebuilding would be a long and difficult journey, one that required trust, patience, and a willingness to confront the pain we had both caused each other. The question was, did I have it in me? Over the next few weeks, I sought advice from those I trusted most. Mark, ever the voice of reason, urged me to consider what I truly wanted. He reminded me that forgiveness was a choice, one that could bring healing but also carried risks. My therapist, meanwhile, encouraged me to focus on my own well-being, to prioritize my needs and emotions before making any decisions about the future. As I grappled with these questions, I began to notice changes in Sophie. She was more attentive with the kids during her visits, more engaged and present than I had seen her in years. She started attending therapy herself, a step she had resisted for so long. Her efforts didn't erase the pain of her betrayal, but they showed me that she was serious about making amends. One night, as I sat in the kitchen flipping through old photo albums, I came across a picture from our wedding day. Sophie and I were standing under a canopy of flowers, her smile radiant as she looked at me. I stared at the photo for a long time, memories of that day flooding back. We had been so young, so full of hope and promise. I wondered if those people still existed beneath the layers of hurt and disappointment we had accumulated over the years. The decision, when it came, felt both monumental and strangely anticlimactic. I called Sophie and asked her to meet me again, this time at our home. When she arrived, I told her that I was willing to try. Not for the sake of nostalgia or obligation, but because I believed there was still something worth fighting for. I made it clear that it wouldn't be easy, that trust would take time to rebuild, and that we both needed to commit fully to the process. Sophie's relief was palpable, her tears falling freely as she thanked me. But even as I hugged her, I felt a lingering sense of caution. This was just the beginning, a tentative first step on a journey that could end in reconciliation or heartbreak. Only time would tell. In the days that followed, we began to rebuild, brick by painful brick. Therapy sessions became a regular part of our routine, both individually and as a couple. We set boundaries and expectations, acknowledging the mistakes we had made while focusing on the path ahead. There were moments of progress, small victories that reminded me of why I had chosen to stay. But there were also setbacks, moments when the anger and mistrust threatened to overwhelm us. Through it all, the kids remained my anchor. Their laughter, their unconditional love, were a reminder of what truly mattered. They didn't fully understand what was happening, but they seemed to sense that we were trying, that we were fighting to keep our family together. As I lay in bed one night, listening to the steady rhythm of Sophie's breathing beside me, I realized that forgiveness wasn't a destination. It was a journey, one that required effort, vulnerability, and a willingness to confront the darkest parts of ourselves. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, I felt a glimmer of hope. Rebuilding trust is a strange thing. It's a process that requires tearing down the rubble of what once was and carefully, painstakingly, piecing together something new. Sophie and I were walking that path, but every step felt uncertain. The therapy sessions helped, as did her consistent efforts to be more transparent, more present. Still, the memory of her betrayal lingered, a ghost that refused to be exorcised. In the months that followed my decision to give our marriage another chance, life began to settle into a semblance of normalcy. Sophie moved back into the house, a transition we navigated with cautious optimism. The kids were ecstatic to have her home, their joy a stark contrast to the trepidation I felt. We resumed our routines, family dinners, weekend outings, bedtime stories. But beneath the surface, I was constantly watching, waiting for any sign that she might falter again. It wasn't an easy way to live, but I told myself it was temporary. Trust, our therapist reminded us, isn't rebuilt overnight. It's earned through consistent actions, through honesty and vulnerability. Sophie seemed to understand that. She kept her phone unlocked and accessible, invited me to join her at gallery events, and shared the details of her day without prompting. I wanted to believe in her sincerity, but there was a part of me that couldn't fully let go of the doubt. That doubt came to a head one evening when I received an unexpected email. The message was anonymous, its subject line blank. Attached was a single image: Sophie and Greg at a cafe, their heads close together, deep in conversation. The photo was recent, dated just a week ago. My heart sank as I stared at the screen, a familiar mix of anger and heartbreak washing over me. I had believed her when she said she had cut ties with Greg, but this image told a different story. I didn't confront Sophie right away. Instead, I saved the image and began piecing together what I could. The cafe was local, one I recognized from the background. The timestamp matched an evening when Sophie had said she was working late at the gallery. I checked her phone that night while she was in the shower, but there were no messages or calls that mentioned Greg. Either she had deleted them, or they had found another way to communicate. The next day, I visited the cafe. I asked the barista if she remembered seeing Sophie and Greg, showing her the photo as proof. She hesitated, clearly uncomfortable, but eventually admitted that they had been there. According to her, they hadn't stayed long, just enough time to share a coffee and what appeared to be a serious conversation. Her description of their interaction didn't sound romantic, but it didn't matter. The fact that Sophie had lied about where she was that evening was enough to shatter the fragile trust we had been rebuilding. That evening, I confronted her. She was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner. When I placed my phone on the counter, the image displayed on the screen. She froze, her expression shifting from confusion to panic as she realized what I was showing her. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The tension in the room was palpable, the air heavy with unspoken accusations. Sophie's explanation was halting, her words tumbling out in a rush as she tried to make me understand. She claimed that she had met Greg to close the chapter, to ensure there were no lingering feelings or unfinished business. She insisted that the meeting had been brief, that nothing inappropriate had happened, and that she hadn't told me because she didn't want to upset me. Her reasoning might have made sense in another context, but in this one, it felt like yet another betrayal. I told her as much, my voice trembling with anger. She had promised me honesty, transparency, and she had failed. Whether or not her intentions were innocent, the fact remained that she had lied, and that lie cut deeper than I expected. Our therapist had warned us about setbacks, about the possibility of stumbling on the road to reconciliation. But hearing those warnings and living through them were two very different things. That night, as I lay awake in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that our marriage was built on a foundation that might never be stable again. How could I trust her when every reassurance felt like a prelude to another lie? In the days that followed, Sophie doubled down on her efforts to repair the damage. She wrote me a letter, pouring her heart onto the page in a way that was both raw and heartbreaking. She admitted to her mistakes, to the fear and shame that had driven her actions. She begged for another chance, promising to do whatever it took to rebuild my trust. Her words were sincere, but sincerity alone wasn't enough. I needed proof, consistency, and time. Mark, ever the pragmatic friend, urged me to take a step back and reassess. He reminded me that I had already given Sophie a second chance, and that I needed to consider what was best for my own well-being and that of the kids. His advice was sound, but it didn't make the decision any easier. Part of me still loved Sophie, still wanted to believe that we could find our way back to each other. But another part of me wondered if I was holding onto a dream that no longer existed. As the weeks turned into months, life settled into a new rhythm. Sophie continued her efforts to rebuild trust, attending therapy regularly and keeping her distance from Greg. She became more involved in the kids' lives, throwing herself into their school activities and hobbies. On the surface, things seemed to be improving, but beneath the veneer of normalcy, I felt a growing sense of detachment. It wasn't until a chance encounter that everything changed. I was at a hardware store, picking up supplies for a home project, when I ran into Greg. He looked surprised to see me, his expression shifting from discomfort to something that resembled guilt. I hadn't planned on speaking to him, but the opportunity was too good to pass up. Our conversation was brief but illuminating. Greg confirmed that Sophie had reached out to him, but he claimed that their meeting had been entirely platonic. He seemed genuinely remorseful for his role in the affair, insisting that it was over and that he had no intention of pursuing Sophie again. But there was something about his demeanor that didn't sit right with me. A hesitance, a reluctance to meet my eyes. It was as though he was holding something back. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. I revisited the image from the cafe, scrutinizing every detail. Something about it felt off, though I couldn't quite put my finger on what. Then it hit me, the angle of the photo. It had been taken from a vantage point that suggested the photographer was deliberately watching them, not just passing by. I began to wonder if someone else was involved, someone who had been following Sophie and Greg, documenting their interactions. The idea was both unsettling and intriguing. If there was a third party orchestrating this, what was their motive? Were they trying to help me, or were they playing their own game? As the pieces of the puzzle began to shift, I realized that the answers I sought might not come from Sophie or Greg, but from the person who had sent me the photo. And so, with equal parts dread and determination, I resolved to find out who they were, and why they had chosen to intervene in my life. The decision to uncover the identity of the person behind the photograph consumed me in a way I hadn't anticipated. There was something deeply unsettling about the idea that someone had been watching Sophie and Greg, documenting their interactions without their knowledge. Whoever they were, they had inserted themselves into my life in a way that felt intrusive, manipulative, and oddly calculated. I needed to know why. I began by revisiting the email that had contained the photograph. The sender's address was a generic, untraceable account, offering no obvious clues about their identity. But when I examined the metadata of the image itself, I found a small but significant lead: GPS coordinates embedded in the file. The coordinates pointed to a location just outside the cafe where Sophie and Greg had met. Armed with this information, I returned to the area, hoping to find some trace of the photographer. I spoke with local shop owners, showed them the photo, and asked if they remembered seeing anyone suspicious. Most people shrugged, offering polite but unhelpful responses. It wasn't until I spoke to a street vendor who worked near the cafe that I got a break. She remembered a man with a camera sitting on a bench across the street that day, his demeanor unremarkable except for the way he seemed to linger, watching the entrance. Her description was vague. Middle-aged, casually dressed, with a baseball cap that obscured much of his face. It wasn't much to go on, but it was enough to confirm that the photo hadn't been a random coincidence. Someone had been watching deliberately, and that someone had gone to great lengths to ensure I saw the results. The question of motive loomed larger than ever. Was this person trying to help me, or was their goal something more sinister? The idea that they might be using me as a pawn in some larger game gnawed at me, but I had no way of knowing for sure. That evening, I decided to confront Sophie once more. I showed her the photograph again, this time focusing on the angle and location. Her reaction was one of genuine confusion, her brow furrowing as she studied the image. She insisted that she had no idea who could have taken it, and for once I believed her. The surprise and unease in her voice felt too genuine to be feigned. As the days passed, I began to notice small, unsettling details in my own life. My phone would occasionally act strangely, its battery draining faster than usual or certain apps behaving erratically. Once, I caught a glimpse of a car parked across the street from my house, its driver obscured by tinted windows. The vehicle was gone when I checked again, but the sense of being watched lingered. Mark, ever the skeptic, suggested I was overthinking things. He urged me to focus on the tangible issues at hand: my marriage, my kids, my own well-being. But even as he spoke, I could tell he wasn't entirely convinced. The idea that someone might be manipulating events from the shadows was too far-fetched to ignore entirely. My search for answers led me to hire a private investigator, a man named Richard who came highly recommended by a friend. He was pragmatic and thorough, asking pointed questions about Sophie, Greg, and the events that had unfolded over the past year. I handed over everything I had: the photograph, the metadata, the accounts of the anonymous email, and waited anxiously for him to uncover something concrete. A week later, Richard called me with news. He had traced the anonymous email to a public Wi-Fi network at a local library, a location that offered little in the way of surveillance or records. However, he had also managed to identify a pattern. Similar emails had been sent to other individuals in the past, each involving cases of infidelity or personal betrayal. It seemed that whoever was behind this had a history of exposing secrets, though their ultimate motive remained unclear. Richard's findings left me with more questions than answers. Was this person some kind of vigilante, driven by a misguided sense of justice? Or were they exploiting vulnerable situations for their own gain? The ambiguity was maddening, but it also reaffirmed my resolve to uncover the truth. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. One evening, as I was reviewing Richard's latest report, I received a second anonymous email. This time, the message was longer, its tone almost conversational. The sender claimed to have been following Sophie and Greg for months, documenting their interactions as part of a broader effort to expose the lies people live. They insisted that their actions weren't personal, that they were simply providing truth to those who deserve it. The message was chilling in its detachment, but it also contained a clue, a reference to an online forum where people discussed infidelity and shared stories of betrayal. Intrigued, I followed the link and began exploring the site. It was a strange, voyeuristic space where users posted anonymously, seeking advice or venting about their experiences. Among the threads, I found a user whose posts matched the tone and content of the email. Their username was Justice Seeker. Through a series of carefully worded posts, Justice Seeker described a philosophy of revealing the hidden truths in relationships, claiming that their actions were driven by a desire to set people free from lies. The posts were unsettling in their conviction, painting a picture of someone who saw themselves as a crusader for honesty, regardless of the collateral damage. I shared my findings with Richard, who dug deeper into the user's activity. Through a combination of digital sleuthing and sheer persistence, he was able to trace the account to a local man named David. The name didn't ring any bells, but when Richard showed me a photo of him, recognition struck like a thunderbolt. David was the barista at the gallery's cafe, someone Sophie had mentioned in passing but never with any significance. The revelation left me reeling. David had been watching Sophie and Greg from the beginning, quietly inserting himself into our lives under the guise of anonymity. His motives, while couched in a rhetoric of justice, felt disturbingly personal. When Richard confronted him, David admitted to his actions but insisted that he had no regrets. He claimed that he had seen too many people live with lies, that he had merely provided the evidence I needed to make informed decisions. David's lack of remorse was both infuriating and unsettling. He had taken it upon himself to meddle in my life, to expose Sophie's betrayal in a way that felt calculated and cruel. But as much as I hated him for what he had done, I couldn't deny that his actions had forced the truth into the open. Without him, I might still be living in ignorance, blind to the cracks in my marriage. In the aftermath of David's confession, I found myself at a crossroads. The revelations of the past year had left me scarred but also stronger. Sophie and I continued to navigate the rocky terrain of reconciliation, though the road ahead remained uncertain. Whether our marriage would survive was a question only time could answer. As for David, I chose not to pursue legal action. Confronting him had brought closure of a sort, and I saw no value in dragging the situation out further. Instead, I focused on what mattered most: my children, my own healing, and the hope that, one day, I might find peace. The journey had been painful, but it had also taught me something invaluable. Truth, no matter how devastating, is the foundation on which to rebuild. And though the scars of betrayal may never fully fade, they are a testament to resilience, a reminder that even in the face of darkness, there is always a path forward.
How was the video? Don't forget to like and subscribe for more videos. Leave your thoughts in the comment below. Thank you for watching. Bye bye.